Hello and welcome to the University of Edinburgh's Research Insights. My name is Hazel Lambert, I'll be your host, and I know that we have lots of new faces on the other side of our screens today, so thank you all for choosing to spend a bit of time with us this afternoon. Scientists and doctors often work closely together in medical research, and I am delighted to introduce you to an incredible research team today. Scientist Professor Philippa Saunders and gynecologist Professor Andrew Horn are going to tell us about how they combine their skills to find better therapies for endometriosis. This event is being recorded, but all of your cameras and mics are off, so we can't see you or hear you. If there's any interruptions, they will be from my house. And if you'd like to share with friends or watch again later, you can access all the videos on our website. Philippa and Andrew, welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, Philippa. Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us. Philippa and Andrew are going to give short presentations, and then afterwards you can ask anything at all about what they've shared. So the Q&A box is open. Type your questions in there, try to keep them short, and you can also upvote so I can see which are most in demand. And we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Now, let's be honest, endometriosis is tough to live with. And so some of the content that you'll see in the slides, some people might find a bit upsetting. There are newspaper headlines that are a little stark, and we have some images from surgery, but it is so important that we can share these with you. They show the reality of what people with endometriosis experience, and I think give a bit of hope for the future, given the progress Philippa and Andrew are making in the lab. And we'll hear from Andrew first, and then Philippa will tell us about the work that she leads. So Professor Andrew Horn works in the hospital as a gynecologist, so he treats people with endometriosis, and he also runs a research team in the lab. It won't be possible for him to give medical advice or comment on individual cases today, but he will be telling us about how endometriosis is usually managed. So Andrew, when you're ready, over to you to share your slides. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Hazel, and thanks very much also for the opportunity you've given Philippa and me to talk about endometriosis and talk about some of the work that we're doing in Edinburgh to try and improve the management of the condition. Oh. Sorry, there's an issue with the slides.
You're okay, Andrew, just take your time. This is because we were practicing earlier.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
So we've broken the talk up into different sections. I'm going to start by talking about what endometriosis is, the symptoms associated with endometriosis, a bit about how it's diagnosed, a bit about treatments that patients with endometriosis might be offered, and then finish off with what I think is the impact that endometriosis has on quality of life. Philippa's then going to really largely focus on the research that we're doing in Edinburgh, and particularly start by showing how we've tried to reframe our research to address what patients with endometriosis want. She's also going to talk about an example of how our laboratory investigations have led to a new clinical trial, and then finish with what I hope are some helpful sources of information. So a few days ago, Endometriosis UK, the biggest patient organisation for endometriosis, published the results of a recent survey that showed that over 50% of people still do not know what endometriosis is. Now, perhaps surprisingly, this is progress since in the last 5 years when this article in the Guardian was published, because at that time, it was estimated that only 20% of the UK population knew what endometriosis was. And I think it's a testament to articles like this and work campaigning, trying to raise awareness of the condition that we are where we are today. But I still think it's staggering that for a condition like endometriosis, which has such a huge socioeconomic impact, that so few people still have heard about the condition. It's said to affect 1 in 10 women. That's the equivalent of over 180 million women worldwide. And apart from anything else, it costs the world's economy huge amounts of money every year. So it's said to be anything around £60 billion per year. So what is endometriosis? Well, broadly speaking, endometriosis can be defined by the presence of tissue like the womb lining, endometrial-like tissue outside of the womb in abnormal places. And we now know that there are 3 subtypes of endometriosis. The first subtype is called superficial peritoneal disease, and it accounts for around 80% of the cases that we see. And the second subtype is deep disease, and the third subtype is ovarian disease. Now, superficial disease tends to be found on the lining of the pelvic cavity. And if you look at this image here, which is a cross-section through the body, if you imagine that this is the skin at the front here, pubic bone, this is the bladder, the womb, the rectum, and the spine at the back. The lining of the pelvic cavity lies here, as you can see. And this image here shows an example of what we see when we look at a laparoscopy at keyhole surgery, when we identify superficial peritoneal disease. Deep disease looks like this, and deep disease we sometimes refer to as infiltrating disease, and it forms these nodules, which are often either near the bladder or, as in this image here, between the bowel and the womb, and they're often associated with scar tissue or adhesions. The third subtype is ovarian disease or endometrioma, so-called chocolate cysts, and they're called chocolate cysts because of the appearance of the altered blood that are seen within the cysts themselves. But endometriosis isn't just a disease of the womb or a disease of the womb lining, because the problem with endometriosis is that it's associated with a range of different symptoms. And the major symptom, and this symptom occurs in 50% of individuals with endometriosis, is pain. And that pain can often be really debilitating, and it can come in different forms. Classically, it comes around menstruation, and it can be cyclical, but it can come outside of menstruation. It can come when opening the bowels. It can come when passing urine. It can cause painful sex. So this pain, as I say, can be really debilitating and really impact upon the quality of life. But endometriosis can also be associated with infertility. It's said that in 1/3 of patients who have endometriosis lesions, they'll have difficulty getting pregnant. It can also be associated with fatigue and lack of energy. And it can also be associated with an impact on mental health. And the consequences of all of these symptoms can also impact upon relationships and the ability to study or hold down a job. The other problem with endometriosis is that increasingly we're seeing it being associated with other problems or conditions as well, such as asthma, some autoimmune and cardiovascular diseases. So how is endometriosis diagnosed? Well, the ovarian subtype is actually fairly straightforward to diagnose. It can be picked up on imaging. This shows an endometrioma or a chocolate cyst on an ultrasound scan. And this appearance is called ground glass appearance, which we classically see with ovarian disease. Deep disease can also often straightforwardly be picked up on imaging, either in the skilled hands of an ultrasonographer, or as in this image here, a nodule shown on an MRI scan. This is the womb again, if you remember back to that picture, and the rectum at the back, and the nodule we can see here on an MRI scan. But the big problem that we have as clinicians, that the commonest type, superficial peritoneal disease, as you can imagine, is very difficult to see on imaging. And in these cases, patients have to undergo surgery. They have to have a general anesthetic and undergo keyhole or laparoscopic surgery to make the diagnosis. And for this reason, and because, as I say, because of this lack of awareness around the condition, and because a lot of these symptoms can cross over and be confused with other conditions as well, sadly, it's meant that there's a delay in the diagnosis of endometriosis. And this diagnosis in the UK currently is staggering, I think. It's a delay of between 7 to 9 years from when a patient first presents with symptoms to when they get the diagnosis and actually receive adequate treatment. And this is something I really think that we have to change. And this is something that I'm sure many of you who have endometriosis are helping us to campaign against and trying to reduce this delay. So how do we manage endometriosis? Well, we can divide this broadly into medical management and surgical management. And medical management largely relies on the fact that we know that endometriosis is what we call an estrogen-dependent condition. So endometriosis is driven by the hormone estrogen produced by the ovaries. So if we give drugs that stop the ovaries producing estrogen, this can often help manage the symptoms of endometriosis, and we potentially think may even help with the progress of the condition. And stopping the ovaries producing the estrogen can be done in different ways. The simplest way is to give the combined pill, but you can give the mini pill or other types of progestrogens, anti-progestrogens, or what you can do is actually give drugs which cause a temporary menopause called Gnrh agonists, or the newer Gnrh antagonists. And all of these drugs can be given by different routes. The problem that we have with these drugs is that not one of them is better than the other. Not one of them stands out above the other as being the best treatment for endometriosis. And all of these treatments, if you kind of compare them in clinical trials, have been shown to be equally effective, but they're not effective in all women. And often, even if they are effective, the symptoms return as soon as they're stopped. And the other problem that we have is that they often have side effects. And this accounts in particularly for the drugs that cause the menopause, because women who take these drugs often have very severe menopause type symptoms. And lastly, the problem with these drugs is that they're all contraceptive. And endometriosis afflicts a young population of women who often want to try and get pregnant, so they don't want to take these sorts of drugs. So what about the alternative, which is surgical management? Well, I've broken down surgical management across the different subtypes on this slide here. So for superficial peritoneal disease, we use laparoscopy or keyhole surgery, either to excise or what we call ablate the disease, either with laser or with diathermy. But what we don't know is actually in which groups of women this treatment actually helps. And we also don't know whether excision or ablation is better. And there's a lot of debate about this at the moment. Ovarian disease, we tend to remove by excision. We tend to what we call strip out or do a cystectomy and remove the endometrioma. And deep disease, again, we tend to excise. But because it's often complex surgery, this surgery is usually done in specialist centres, which have to be accredited by a society called the BSG in the UK. But again, like medical management, surgical management is by no means perfect. Not everybody gets better after surgical management. And we also, even in patients who do get better, see a high recurrence of symptoms. And this is said to be anything up to 20% within 2 years, up to 50% within 5 years. And we don't really know why this is, whether this is due to the fact that new lesions actually have developed, or whether some lesions, because they're too tiny or microscopic, have been missed at the time of surgery. But I think probably it's more complicated than that, and it's probably because we don't fully understand endometriosis and the fact that surgery ignores the role, for example, of nerves and immune cells, which we know are important for endometriosis and its development. As a consequence, sadly, in surveys, only 1/3 of women feel that their current pain treatment for endometriosis is effective. And I just want to finish with this slide. I said I would look at the impact of endometriosis on quality of life. And I just want to show you what a big impact it can have on some women and what I hope that we can do to try and make things better. So if you look at the x-axis here, this is lifetime potential. And if you look along here, this is time in years. This black line is this, if you like, the life course of anybody, an individual who doesn't have a chronic condition, who doesn't have endometriosis. This red pink line is a patient potentially with endometriosis, hopefully the worst case scenario. And you can see the impact of various factors on their lifetime potential. And that can include the symptoms, but it can also include the treatments, such as multiple surgeries that some patients have to undergo. What Philippa and I would like to see is this line moving up here to this orange line, whereby patients are offered surgical treatment where it's appropriate and where it actually is of benefit. Hormone treatments that are also helpful and don't have significant side effects, and appropriate pain management. We want to see patients with endometriosis achieve their full lifetime potential. And I'll hand over to Philippa now, who's going to talk about the work that we're doing in Edinburgh to try and address this.
Andrew, thank you so much. We've got loads of questions coming in already, so I think we're going to have a great discussion later. Thank you, everyone. Keep them coming. Just post them in the box. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Philippa Saunders. Philippa is an expert in the hormones that rule our reproductive lives. She looks really closely at how these hormones influence healthy tissues and what's going on at a molecular level when there's an illness like endometriosis developing. She leads a research group in the lab focused on reproductive conditions and also spends a lot of her time advising other scientists on how to develop their research and progress their ideas. So Philippa, when you're ready, please start your presentation.
Thank you, Hazel. We'll try the share screen function and make sure we can get things working. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. So I'd just like to add my welcome to everybody else for this evening and say thank you for joining us. I'm a biomedical researcher and I have spent more than 30 years studying women's health conditions, and endometriosis is probably the most challenging one I've ever studied. So the thing that matters to me is that the work we do in the laboratory is relevant to that of the patients we seek to assist. And for this, we have gone back to talk to the patients and those who are responsible for their care to ask what it is that they want in terms of new treatments. And the way we approached this was to run what was called a priority setting partnership. So this is a organised process where we bring together patients, carers and clinical groups on an equal footing, and we ask them to tell us which questions they want addressed by our research. And at the end of this process, we seek to come up with a jointly agreed research priorities, which we can then publicise and use to raise the money that's very much needed for the research we wish to conduct. So we conducted a PSP under these in this way, and for this we started out with a survey, and we asked people who were interested in endometriosis or had endometriosis what research questions they would like addressed. The survey was incredibly successful, and we had nearly 2,000 people who responded to it, which was quite a record at the time for these PSP processes. And from this, we got nearly 5,000 questions, and a number of common themes emerged. So we looked at these questions, gave some really careful scrutiny to them, grouped those together that were similar, and ran a second survey using the top 72 questions from our first survey. And we ranked these according to those which, again, our respondents thought were most important. And this gave us a data set of 30 questions. And then we held a meeting which brought together patients, NHS staff. And between us, in a very dynamic way, we agreed a top 10 questions that we believed were really important for research. Now, the important thing about this survey was that we were able to publish these findings in a prestigious academic journal. And for us, it was important that we then received a lot of media attention, and it led to discussions with funders who were interested in then giving money for the research which we wished to conduct. We also were able to do some extra work by talking to delegates at a World Congress, which was mostly researchers from around the world. And we looked at what they thought the priorities were. And there were some quite interesting parallels and differences. And we also published this work. So Andrew and I have used this information to really guide the kind of research that we've been doing over the last few years. And from the topics that came up in this very dynamic and interactive process, a number of different themes emerged. So one of the things that emerged was a real desire on the part of the patients and the people caring for them to look for different ways of treatment that they might be able to approach themselves, such as changes in diet or exercise. They really were looking for improvements in diagnosis of endometriosis, as Andrew has articulated to you. And there was a number of other interesting areas that emerged that we have been following up on in our research. So the ones that we've particularly focused in are these top 4 on this slide. So the first one is whether we could reduce the number of lesions or their ability to grow within the pelvis. And of course, this is important because if we can stop the disorder from developing and the pain being initiated, we clearly have an opportunity to improve care. We are also interested if we can find really strong evidence that diet might influence endometriosis and pain. A lot of patients have told us that they do use dietary modification, but what we want is to look at this in a scientific way, and indeed we're planning to follow up on this. And then we're also interested in the idea of personalised therapies and whether we can alter the function of inflammatory and immune cells. But it's the top one on this list that I'm going to address in the following slides. Sorry, my slides keep going backwards and forwards. In the following slides, because this is one where we have seen, we've been able to take work from the laboratory and use it all the way through to a new clinical trial. So the starting point for this work has been looking at samples that have been donated us very generously by the patients who are under Andrew's care. And these have included a number of different samples that we've obtained from women during medical investigations. Now, you've seen a few examples of what the interior of the pelvis looks like, so I can now tell you about some of the samples that we've obtained. And the first of these is obviously samples of the lesions themselves, including those from the peritoneal wall and other sites, as shown by these red circles. Another really important topic of our study has been actually the cells that line this peritoneal cavity that, of course, surrounds all the organs within our body and stops them sticking together. And these are really important cells. They look tiny on a cross-section through the tissue that I'm showing here, but actually there's a whole raft of them all over the surface. And the final very informative sample set that we've got is the fluid that bathes the internal organs, and indeed the very rich number of immune cells that we find within this cavity. And of course, underlying all of this is the idea that if we take the studies on these patient samples and fluids, we then can identify changes very specific to patients with endometriosis and chronic pelvic pain, and this can feed on into our research activity. So actually, this has been a fascinating study, and a few years ago, with a PhD student looking at the mesothelial cells, we noticed a number of different results that really set us on a path towards a new level of investigation. Firstly, we looked at this fluid that's bathing the internal organs, and we found it had really high concentrations of a factor called transforming growth factor beta. The second thing we found in the fluid was it contained lots of high concentrations of a substance called lactate. And finally, we were able to show that actually some of this lactate is being made by those mesothelial lining cells that I told you about, and furthermore, that they were being stimulated to make this lactate by this TGF-beta. So there seems to be a sort of perfect storm going on here, where the TGF-beta is making the cells make more lactate. Now, why would we be interested in lactate specifically? Well, we're really interested in lactate because it's known to promote cell proliferation and invasion. And these are two processes which we as biologists know play a key role in the formation of lesions. So this was absolutely a breakthrough for us. Now, with this breakthrough came an opportunity. We reasoned that if we could block this lactate being made, we could stop these cells invading and dividing, and maybe then some of these cells that are making these lesions might not make lesions anymore. So I want to introduce you to the idea of drug repurposing. So when I talked a number of years ago to some people in the pharmaceutical industry, and I said, we really need new therapies for endometriosis, they said, oh yes, we agree with that, but it's going to take 25 years. Now, I'm a very impatient person, as everybody will tell you, and absolutely 25 years is far too long to wait for a new therapy. So the idea of drug repurposing is we use our information to look for a drug that's already out there, which we can then repurpose for use in endometriosis. And dichloroacetate, the one I'm going to talk about on this slide, is the drug we came up with. So why were we looking at DCA? We were looking at DCA because we found the enzyme that it inhibits was increased in those mesothelial cells that I've been telling you about. This drug had been approved for more than 30 years for use in children and was considered safe. It also meant that we could then take the drug and test it in all our culture systems and see if it worked. And that's what we did. So I've been telling you about samples from patients, but it's really important that what we do is take the cells and samples we have, and we're able to manipulate them within the laboratory. And for this, we formed what we call the lesion in the lab. So we've talked about the lesion on the body wall, but what we want is to actually be able to make a mini lesion in a dish in the lab. So in my mini lesion, I've got these mesothelial cells on the bottom of my dish, and I have suspended above them in a little well the cells that might be in my lesion. So I've got my mesothelial cells and my stromal cells, which are my lesion cells. And then what I can do is look at how the lactate produced by the mesothelial cells influences those lesion cells. And I can treat these cells by putting my TGF-beta with or without my drug into the culture dish. So we've got the mesothelial cells in the lower chamber, they're the peritoneal wall. We've got the stromal cells in the upper chamber, these are my lesion. I've got the medium, which is my surrogate for the peritoneal fluid. I've got the TGF-beta, which I've told you is in the peritoneal fluid, and I'm going to add the drug, and I'm going to look at what it does to my endpoints. And endpoints is a fancy term for the effect. So we look for what's happened with lactate, and we look at an output which might be relevant to what's going on in the lesion, and that's cell division, proliferation, increase in cell number. So this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it shows the results from these experiments. So on the left-hand side are a series of different treatments indicated by different coloured bars. So blue is baseline, nothing there. Green is some of the DCA alone. Red is if we put the TGF-beta in, which is our stimulant, and DCA and TGF-beta is in the orange bar. And the left-hand panel shows the production of lactate. And the take-home message is that when we add in the drug, it blocks the effects of the TGF-beta, which is causing the overproduction of the lactate. And even more excitingly, if we add in the DCA in the right-hand set of results, it stops the cells dividing. So there's less of them there to form a lesion in my mini lesion in a dish. So the work in the lab is exciting to me, but what's much more exciting is if we can take this work forward and we can actually apply it to treating women. And this is what we do in clinical trials. So a clinical trial is where a drug or other potential therapy is given to a person, and they then report on whether they feel better as a result of the drug in a way that is carefully monitored, carefully organised and overseen by our expert trials team. And this trial, which is called EPIC, has just recently started. In it, it's being run here in NHS Lothian. It's involving 30 women. They're going to be given the DCA for 12 weeks, and we're going to follow them up. Really, the endpoint we're really interested in is whether they see an improvement in their pain, because that's what the patients really want to see, an improvement in their pain. And I'm delighted to say that the trial has started, and so far we're seeing some quite promising results, and we're looking forward to reporting on this shortly. So I've given you an example of something we've seen all the way through from a very early stage of looking at some fluids and cells right the way through to the lab and then on to a clinical trial. But this is, of course, part of a much bigger part of work that we're doing. And this is just a few of the other new projects that we're engaged in, all of which have clearly been informed by that input from the patients and the clinical people as to what they think are the most important research questions. So Andrew and his colleagues are running a surgical trial with randomization and follow-up. I'm working with colleagues across Europe to improve the reproducibility in our preclinical models so that we can be much better at fast-tracking drug testing and drug repurposing. In the drug repurposing field, we've been casting our net a bit wider and thinking about other conditions which involve pain. And examples of these include migraine, where there's been some very good breakthroughs in drugs that are effective treatments. And actually, some of our genetics colleagues have shown real parallels between migraine and endometriosis in terms of the genes affected. And we know endometriosis is an inflammatory condition. And so we're looking again at all the drugs that might treat inflammatory conditions. We've had a very exciting recent collaboration with an expert group in Singapore who've started looking in blood for biomarkers, and a number of these are showing great promise, and we're hoping to follow up on this. And in 2 new student projects, which are starting in September, we're going back to many of the things that came up in our PSP and pushing forward with new personalised treatments. We're investigating wearable technology and the use of much more advanced data analytics. And we're just in the process of recruiting a new student to work on the impact of diet and food metabolites in pain. And this project, I'm happy to say, has been very much with the support and input from our patient advocates, the West Lothian Endo Warriors. I know many of you on this call will be interested in following up on other aspects that we've not been able to cover in this short presentation. And therefore, knowing that this presentation is recorded, I've also put on this slide a number of the other sources of information that you and your friends and colleagues may find useful. And I particularly note that the patient organisations do have some very useful information and support group advice. And finally, it would be very remiss on me not to really acknowledge the people and the organisations who have supported us and guided us in doing this work. I've already mentioned the Endo Warriors in West Lothian, who we're most grateful to. A lot of the work in my laboratory over the last more than 20 years has been supported by generous grants from the Medical Research Council. We're very grateful to the support we've received from Standard Life, who've been a wonderful employer and advocate group. The work I described for you leading up to the clinical trial was in part supported by an outstanding charity called Wellbeing of Women. And we've been very grateful to the Charles Wolfson Charitable Trust for their ongoing support. So I'd just like to close by really thanking you for your attention. And Andrew and I both look forward to a vibrant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. We have so many questions in the Q&A box. It's fantastic. But I'll start with a theme that's come up a few times around diagnosis and how long it can take people to get a diagnosis of endometriosis. So there's 2 questions for you there, Andrew. The first is, what information should people take to their GP? And then the second question is for you, Philippa, around the research that you're doing. Do you think that that could have an impact on diagnosis time? Is there anything that you're doing there that could reduce this time? So Andrew, what do people need to take to their GP to try and get a faster diagnosis?
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. So I suppose we have to accept that GPs are dealing with a whole range of different conditions and, you know, have sometimes minutes to make a diagnosis or instigate a treatment. So if you can go to your GP with information about endometriosis and even mention the word endometriosis to start with, I think that's helpful. I tend to direct people towards the NICE guidance, and there's NICE guidelines for endometriosis that are also very patient friendly as well. You can take them or point your GP in that direction. I think the other thing is, if you find that you're not getting anywhere with one GP, it's perfectly reasonable to ask to go and speak to another GP who may have more knowledge around endometriosis, and just ask, you know, to be referred if you feel that you're not being listened to or not being helped.
Thank you. And Philippa, do you think the research you're doing might help with cutting diagnosis times?
Well, the holy grail in all of this is a biomarker. I mean, what we want, what everyone wants, is that we can take a blood sample, we can look at the blood sample from an individual who's not yet had a diagnosis, and we can say that they think there's a decent probability they have got endometriosis. And that is something we've been working on in a number of different ways over the last few years. I mean, it's been a very frustrating journey for many researchers because it's been hard to nail down these biomarkers, in part because there's been a whole variability in terms of diagnosis. I mean, we've got different types of the disease and other things. So I think the breakthrough that we're making now by looking at two different sort of ways of it. We're looking at metabolites in the blood, and we've got a couple of really promising ones that we're following up on with the group in Singapore. Some people are looking at the immune cell profile, and that's had big breakthroughs in the cancer field in being able to immune cell profile. And also, I'm really pleased to say that the commercial sector are really getting on board with this as well. And Roche, who are a company with pretty deep pockets, are putting a lot of money into doing this. And I think this is an excellent, it's really good news when you see the commercial sector getting involved, because we as academics really need the commercial people to develop the assays. So when we see them really getting enthused and getting in touch and talking to us about what's necessary, then I have real hope. I think, I'm always an optimist, but I think we're going to have a biomarker within the next 3 to 5 years.
And a biomarker, for anyone who's not hanging about in science crowds like us, basically it just means something that we can detect in a blood test, something that shows you what's going on inside your body that you can get out of a blood test. And NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, I'll put a link to that in the email that you all get after this webinar. So don't worry about looking it up. Okay, there's lots of really popular questions in the Q&A box, and one of them is about whether or not endometriosis is a progressive disease. Does it have to get worse? Can it get better? Andrew, I think that's one for you.
So again, fantastic question, and I'm afraid one I don't have a good, clear answer to. This is largely goes back, it relates to the biomarker question, because in order to follow up someone who's had a diagnosis of endometriosis, because we don't have a non-invasive way of monitoring non-invasive tests, you would almost have to subject them to repeated laparoscopies, keyhole surgeries, to see what happens. So very, very difficult to know what we talk about as the natural history of the condition. What we have learned from animals, we've learned from non-human primates who have developed on endometriosis spontaneously, is that where we have been able to follow up some of these animals, that sometimes endometriosis actually gets better without any intervention, and sometimes it does progress and get worse, and sometimes it stays the same. So that's information from animals, but we don't really have any good information from patients at the moment. But that's something that, as Philippa says, if we can identify a biomarker, we might be able to understand better.
Okay, and following up on that, there's a question from Oliver, and he's asking, in terms of advancing the disease, is there much information about whether superficial becomes deep or ovarian or vice versa? Does it move around essentially?
Yeah, so again, a really good question, Oliver. I think there's lots of debate as to whether these subtypes are actually almost different diseases in themselves as well. So when we talk about the sort of theories around why, for example, superficial peritoneal disease develops, it's around this theory which was put forward in the 1920s by somebody called Sampson, and it's retrograde menstruation, and then somehow the tissue was thought to stick to the lining of the womb. That theory doesn't really work for the nodules or for the endometrioma, the cysts on the ovaries. So the first question is, are these maybe slightly different diseases with different causes, different ways of developing? But I think the question about whether one leads to another, again, just really difficult, because we don't have a way of monitoring and following up patients. Some patients seem to just have one subtype. Other patients seem to have a combination of different subtypes. And sometimes somebody might have a surgery for one subtype and later down the line seem to have developed one of the others, but we don't really have a pattern as yet, unfortunately.
And in the clinical trials that you're talking about, do you, Philippa, this is probably one for you, is there any comparison with healthy subjects, as it were? There was a question here about levels of lactate in the peritoneal cavity. Is there any comparison with women that don't have endometriosis?
I think I should have made that clear, that the reason we fixed on the lactate was it was much higher in the samples we got from the patients with endometriosis, and it was lower in the individuals coming for other conditions who hadn't got endometriosis, where we were fortunate to get some peritoneal fluid. And it can be quite challenging, actually, interestingly, to find individuals coming for a procedure where we can get some peritoneal fluid who don't have endometriosis or any other problem. And indeed, a few years ago, we were really looking for samples which we would call, in the scientific parlance, we call controls. In other words, individuals where there's no reason to think they've got endometriosis at all, not whatsoever. And when we were taking samples with their consent from these individuals, we found actually that several of them did have lesions. But what that was they'd never had a symptom that meant that they had gone to the doctor about it. On the other hand, as Andrew will probably tell you, sometimes people have just sort of suffered in silence and actually maybe did have some symptoms, but never got it diagnosed. So just to answer the question, yes, absolutely, it's absolutely fundamental that we are comparing the patients we know have been diagnosed with endometriosis with those who haven't had a diagnosis of endometriosis, but maybe have pain, and those who absolutely don't have any pain or any endometriosis at all. So we would call them a control.
I'm really glad that you used that phrase, suffer in silence, because that's one of the reasons why we do events like this, isn't it? We want people to understand that this extreme pain is not necessarily normal. And so, talk about it, share what your pain is like, use it as a flag if it sounds like your periods are so much more painful than anyone else's. Andrew, is there anything that you can say about that when you meet people in the clinic for the first time, and perhaps to advise? There's a question here from Kirstine, whose daughter she thinks may have endometriosis. She's 19. It took her a long time to get diagnosed. What do they need to be looking out for?
I think one of the challenges has been that, as you say, people have suffered in silence, and sometimes, even within a family or within friends, people have said, oh, it's normal to have pain with periods, etc. But I always say to people, if that pain is interfering with any aspect of your life, whether it's your ability to, go out and socialize or have relationships or study, go to work, that's not a normal pain. And at that point, it's really important that you go and seek help and you tell your doctor, your GP, your gynecologist, this is really having an impact on my life. So I think that's the kind of tipping point for me, because it is very difficult, because people do experience pain in different ways. But if it's impacting on your ability to function, that's when you need to seek help.
That actually, the most popular question here in the Q&A box is from Kirsty, and she says, are there steps being taken to improve support to women with endometriosis and managing symptoms during the pandemic? She said she knows that many women, herself included, have felt abandoned in their treatments and left feeling quite helpless.
Yeah, I think we all really appreciate how difficult it's been, particularly during the summer months, where a lot of appointments were changed, cancelled, surgeries have been postponed. We did, certainly in Edinburgh and in Lothian, we put together some guidance with regard to self-care that people with endometriosis can do, and that's on our website. I was also involved in some international publications about self-care, which we've promoted a lot on social media. In Edinburgh, we are trying to do our best to catch up with all the appointments. The real difficulty that we have is that obviously there's only a certain number of us who can deliver the clinics. Some of the clinics we have to deliver by telephone or by video, so that's been challenging in itself. And the problem that we have with the operating lists at the moment is we've got the same amount of theatre time, but because of COVID, we can only anaesthetise a much fewer number of patients. So as well as the backlog, we still aren't even working at full capacity. And now these are probably sound like excuses, but that's where we are at the moment, and that's what we're trying to do. But what I would say is, look at the information that we have on the website, and hopefully that's helpful. We also have a specialist nurse who we're trying to increase her time to see if she can help as well and give advice over the telephone. But I appreciate it's really difficult for everybody, and I can only apologise for that.
Thank you, Andrew. And we have so many questions. We've just got time for one more. So there's one theme that has come up repeatedly, and that's on GnRH long term. So asking whether there's any studies on the use of, tell us what GnRH is as well for anyone that might not know, any studies on the use of them long term.
Yeah, so again, a really good question. So Gnrh agonists, so GnRHR is gonadotrophin releasing hormone, and the Gnrh agonists are the drugs that are sometimes given to cause a temporary menopause. Most commonly, they're given as a monthly injection. They're completely reversible. One of the sort of problems that we have is that the manufacturers of the drug have only licensed them for 6 months. And that's really because it's not really of any benefit for them to extend the license. But there have been a number of studies looking at long-term use. And as long as they're given with HRT, so we give HRT to protect the bones and to protect the heart if people want to take these longer term. And we also, in Edinburgh, we do a bone scan at baseline and then do more regular bone scans. I think I would still like to see more evidence about long-term use. So one of the discussions we're having is whether we can have some kind of national database where people can register if they take these treatments. But it's like all of the treatments for endometriosis, there's actually not enough research for any of them to look at their benefit, pros and cons. We'd really like, as Philippa said, to be able to find a way of predicting which one is the best for somebody rather than them having to take them for 6 months to see if they work. So with Gnrh agonists, I would say if there's something that works for you, discuss that with your doctor with regard to how long you take them, and we would then instigate the appropriate monitoring in those cases.
Thank you, Andrew. So there's hope. We've clearly heard tonight we're going in the right direction. There's still so much more to do. Thank you both so much for sharing where you are with your work and for putting so much of your heart and soul into it as well. I know how hard you both work and how committed you both are to this issue. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much for all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but we know this is a really important topic, so maybe we'll try and do something else on it again in the future. Thank you to Nick, Jen, Lisa, Lana and Ginny, who are in the background, made everything work this evening. These events are our way to share the latest in research with you, but we'd like to know what you want to hear about. So I'm going to put up a slide in a couple of minutes to a website called menti.com with a code. If you go put the code in, then you can tell us what topic you'd really like to see covered in our final event in March. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with the Generation Scotland team, who are going to share what they've learned about people's experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic across Scotland. We're all in the same storm, but it's clear we're not all in the same boat. So they've been capturing how people have coped so that we can learn from it in the future. But for now, take care. I hope you're cozy at home and that you can join us again in the future. Thanks. Just need to remember how to share my screen.